have lunch.
Yeah, exactly.
Richard, once you finish it, I will ask us some other fellow,
long questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Please, voila.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Moon, for hosting all of us here today. It's an honor to be here this morning and to offer a few thoughts. We're really pleased to be in Seoul at this time, which is quite obviously a time of great importance for the alliance, and then, of course, on the eve of President Park's visit to Washington. And so what I thought I would do today is offer a few thoughts on Korea-U.S. relations as I see them in terms of where they stand and where they could go from here, building on what I think we should all acknowledge is an extraordinarily strong foundation that has existed for many years and that seems to only get stronger by the year. What I'd like to do is examine U.S.-Korea ties along three perspectives. First, the peninsular dimension of Korea-U.S. ties, and then the regional dimension, and then the global dimension. And then, given that we are visiting from Washington, D.C., I thought I would try to offer a few thoughts on Asia policy in general in the context of U.S. politics. I won't comment on Korean politics because you all can tell us about that. But yeah, I'll try to make at least a little bit of sense for our politics in Washington and where Asia policy in general and Korea policy in particular stands. And then, of course, if there are questions and comments after that, I would invite any that you might have. So just to start with sort of the fundamentals, I think the Korea-U.S. relationship, as we all know, is broad, it's strong, it enjoys wide bipartisan support in the United States. The American commitment to the alliance is, as I can see, as strong as it's ever been, and policymakers in Washington keenly wish for the United States to be Seoul's partner of choice in matters related to security, diplomacy, and economics. Seoul, South Korea rather, is America's sixth largest goods trading partner. That volume is likely to increase under the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. According to the most recent Gallup poll that was taken, 64% of Americans have a positive view of South Korea. And the 2012 Chicago Council survey indicated that 60% of Americans support long-term U.S. bases in South Korea. And that's a higher percentage, interestingly, than the percentage of Americans that support bases in Japan or Germany or Australia. And so I think it's for this reason that most in Washington really value the relationship with Korea, but also looked with concern at the deterioration of relations between our two Northeast Asian allies over the past several years, and have welcomed some of the recent thawing in relations between Seoul and Tokyo that we've seen just over the past couple of months. And it's also why some have questions about the nature and desired end state of Seoul's relationship with China. China, of course, presents the United States with a complex set of challenges and opportunities, as President Xi, who is currently in Washington State but will soon be in Washington, D.C. for a state visit, as his imminent visit demonstrates, the U.S.-China bilateral agenda is full and it's complicated, and it's consists of a mixture of areas of cooperation and areas of potential conflict or disagreement. And so where South Korea sees itself in terms of its relationship with China is something of great interest to policymakers today in Washington. Let me just talk for a moment about the peninsular dimension of the relationship. The bedrock of that dimension, of course, is the alliance and including the American troops stationed in South Korea, the close cooperation of our militaries, the commitment to deter and repel threats that might erupt on the peninsula. And it's worth, I think, recalling something that we don't often reflect on as much as perhaps we should, which is that America's only troop presence on the Asian mainland is here in South Korea. And given the decades of experience that our two militaries have in working together in joint exercises and training. It has a significance that is intrinsic to stability on the peninsula, but that goes beyond that. When you talk about the relationship between South Korea and the United States along the peninsular dimension, you almost immediately begin talking about North Korea. And one thing that I think has become clear, and perhaps more than it had in recent years to policymakers in Washington, is that since Kim Jong-un has taken charge, that Pyongyang represents not just a threat to our allies south of 30th parallel, but also to the United States itself. We see this on the lower end with things like the hack of the Sony IT systems, and the continual threat that exists to American troops stationed in South Korea, but also some quite disturbing developments, including North Korea's twin efforts to both miniaturize nuclear weapons and be able to mate them to delivery vehicles, and to develop submarine-launched ballistic missiles. And on top of this, of course, you have the appalling human rights situation in North Korea that violates our deepest sense of ethics and values, and that seems to, the brutality of which seems to extend quite obviously to the inner circle of the leadership these days. When you add to these developments on the nuclear side, on the submarine-launched ballistic missile side, on the cyber capability side, when you add to that the increased uncertainty that seems to characterize the young Mr. Kim's rule, the challenge only increases, I think, for the United States and for South Korea. For all of the threats and all of the difficulties posed by the regimes of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, our North Korea watchers often said, well, at least there's a method to the madness. You can sort of get what they're going toward, even if they have a very a dangerous way of pursuing their international objectives. They provoke in order to get goodies from the international community, or for some other reason. And since Kim Jong-un has taken place, some of our North Korea watchers see less a method to the madness than just madness, and aren't quite sure what the underlying rationale is to the bombast, what the desired goals, what the objectives are of the regime in Pyongyang today. Are they trying to get international aid? Do they want prestige? Do they want a level of acceptance? Are they trying to deter what they think would otherwise be an attack on North Korea? There's a strong dose of, if not irrationality, then certainly unpredictability in North Korean decision making, and it's very difficult to assess what Kim Jong-un's intentions are and how he intends to achieve them. And so when you sort of combine this opacity and difficulty in assessing the intentions, the aggressiveness, the impulsiveness that characterizes both the domestic and the foreign behavior, it quite obviously produces a real set of deep challenges for the United States and for South Korea. And of course it puts deterrence at a premium. It also means, it seems to me, that there's an opportunity that may not have existed as much in the past to begin to build a consensus around particular unification scenarios. The government in Seoul, I think, has expressed hope that it can bring Beijing closer to its view of what unification might look like, given China's palpable dissatisfaction with the government and disenchantment with its sort of semi-client in Pyongyang. And now I think is the opportunity for certainly Seoul, but others as well, to try to push forward the consultations that would include all the interested parties to examine, what would a hard landing in North Korea look like? What would a soft landing look like? What would scenarios in between resemble? And what kind of challenges and opportunities do they present for all of us? I think it's also worth articulating from an American perspective the case for continued American engagement in the peninsula even after unification. Again, with this being the only place where Americans or troops are present on the Asian mainland, then the significance of that troop presence and of American engagement in the peninsula is directed primarily at the North Korean threat, but is not exclusive to it. And so, some of the things that have been discussed as potential opportunities to move ahead, including deployment of THAAD, Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Systems, and other ways of beefing up the presence and engagement on the peninsula, seem to me to be worth considering very seriously. Let me move now just from the sort of peninsular perspective to a regional one, and talk just for a moment about ties with China. It's interesting to reflect that about the economic relationship between South Korea and China, which now South Korea's trade with China is greater than South Korea's trade with both the United States and Japan combined. And we see in Washington, Beijing that is actively courting South Korea. Some have worried that Beijing is trying to use the history issues related to comfort women in Japan as a way to drive a wedge between South Korea and Japan, and to pull Seoul closer to Beijing as a result of some shared sense of grievance. That at the same, and at the same time you have Seoul reaching out to Beijing to again try to get it on the same page in terms of unification. So I think this is something that those of us in Washington who look at this set of relationships have a number of questions about where this goes and what the possible goals are and end state here. There's also a few questions about the extent of South Korea's regional ambitions. Is the South China Sea important to South Korea? Is it important in more than an abstract way? Freedom of navigation is important to everybody. Is it important enough that South Korea would at some point, take some sort of actions there, patrols or whatever it is? What is the scope for trilateral cooperation between the United States, Japan, and Korea as this thaw continues, hopefully? And then I'll move. Then I sort of offered more questions and answers on the regional perspective, and I think I have more questions still probably when I now move to kind of the global perspective. The global Korea framework that President Lee Myung-bak had announced is something that I think is very welcomed by folks in Washington, and I think is, as President Park prepares to come to Washington, is a real area of potential opportunity in the bilateral relationship. We can expect, the conversations and the statements, et cetera, about the nature of North Korea and so forth. But to look at Korea as a globally influential power and as a U.S.-Korea relationship as of global importance is really an exciting opportunity, I think, for those who've worked on this particular set of issues. And in fact, and Dr. Krohn and I were reflecting on this earlier, Korea is doing a lot around the world, some of which it doesn't get enough credit for. If you think about the Korean teams that were deployed to Sierra Leone during the Ebola crisis, Korea's aid to Syrian refugees, its deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, peacekeeping, anti-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden off of Somalia, and its membership in the Multinational Naval Task Force. There are many areas where Korea is acting as a globally important power, and I think that is the area of most opportunity in terms of the relationship. Just in terms of what that might mean as some specifics, I'd offer, cooperation on humanitarian relief efforts around the world, foreign aid, coordinating our foreign aid efforts in third countries, and our military training efforts in third countries. Reconstruction missions in places that are either devastated by natural disasters or by warfare, counterproliferation and interdiction operations, cyberspace and cybersecurity cooperation, and then building on the kind of cooperation that we already see evident in internet governance with the conference that was hosted here on the future of internet governance. So I think there's a number, and I'm sure you could all add to that potential list of areas. But I think it's worth taking seriously this idea of a global Korea and seeing how we can make it not just global Korea, but global Korea-United States, and how we can work together. So now kind of each of the perspectives that I've talked about, the peninsular, the regional, the global, are obviously informed by politics. And as I said, I'm not going to dare to comment on Korean domestic politics. But politics in the United States, I'm slightly more qualified to speak about. Although I have to say the politics in the United States, as you may have observed, can itself be baffling and Byzantine and incomprehensible. So I'll do my best here to provide a perspective given my experiences in the kind of arena. As I'm sure you know, one of the signature elements of President Obama's foreign policy is the rebalance to Asia, or the pivot to Asia, or the whatever to Asia, whatever word you want to use. And it aims to recognize that the locus of economic dynamism and of geopolitical competition will increasingly be located, for the United States, will increasingly be located in the Indo-Pacific region. And so what this has meant in practice is an attempt to increase the focus on Asia and to reduce America's involvement in other regions, and especially in the greater Middle East. So an administration that inherited wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, it often spoke of a strategic distraction of a country, the United States, devoting its time, its energy, and many of its resources to places that were of less strategic importance than Asia. And it sought to correct that strategic distraction, strategic imbalance. So far so good conceptually. As a concept, the rebalance or the pivot won support in the United States Congress and among foreign policy thinkers of both parties, but that wasn't, of course, the end of the story. Despite this attempt to devote a major and greater share of military assets, for example, to the Asia-Pacific, devote more policymaker time and attention to the region, and to wind down American commitments elsewhere, the world hasn't really let us do that. President Obama withdrew all the American troops from Iraq, only to send thousands back in. His administration has conducted military operations in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Libya, Somalia, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, none of which are in East Asia. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has meant stepped-up military commitment in Central and Eastern Europe in an effort to shore up NATO's flank, and we have a major reassurance initiative designed specifically to reassure our allies in Central and Eastern Europe. The nuclear deal with Iran has left Israel and a number of Arab countries feeling uneasy about the American commitment to their own security and in need of their own reassurance from the United States. And so the United States, Washington is now in the process of developing packages of increased military assistance and activity in the Middle East. And of course, the fight against the Islamic State continues to consume American resources, including some of which end up getting redeployed from the Asia Pacific. So while the concept has won a lot of support among Republicans and Democrats and independents and everyone else, we don't seem to be able to move away from other regions in terms of our involvement to the degree to which, at least I think this administration would prefer. I recently was speaking with a friend of mine who works on the National Security Council staff, and I said, okay, we've rebalanced to Asia, we've pivoted to Asia. If you were to estimate how many meetings in the White House Situation Room are on the subject of Asia versus how many are on the subject of the Middle East, what would you say? And this person estimated that there were 10 on the Middle East for every 1 on Asia. So I don't know if that's the right metric, but it seems to be something less than a full rebalance to Asia, if that's indicative in any way. On top of this, all this is taking place against a backdrop of these declining defense budgets and a politics in Washington that is dysfunctional in more ways than one. This budget mechanism, sequestration, has really hurt the ability of the Defense Department to sort of plan prudently and make smart investments. And the infighting on Capitol Hill may lead to another government shutdown in the matter of a week or two. And so when you combine this, I guess the point with this is that the rebalance to Asia is conceptually the right way to think about things, I think. But the politics of this has been more about the execution and whether the rebalance actually adds up to something meaningful in a way. Now, before I sort of paint too negative a picture here, though, about at least the rebalance and about American politics, I would offer that I think all of these challenges are ultimately manageable, and that in terms of the Korea-U.S. relationship, the outlook is actually rather bright. If you look at recent history, for example, Congress, despite its growing allergy to free trade, did pass the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement a while back and passed fast-track trade authority for the president, and I believe it'll pass the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and after that may take other economic steps that will impact positively the Korea-U.S. relationship and our trade relations with Asia more broadly. Support for placing a greater priority on Asia is high in both parties, though, as I said, the argument is not really about whether we should pay more attention to Asia and do more in Asia. It's about whether this administration is doing enough in Asia or whether there are other ways to do it, and also about how we characterize this. What words do we use to describe it so as to set the right set of expectations? And then I guess the final thing that I'll sort of offer is if any of you are watching our rather entertaining presidential election campaign, it doesn't feel like the summer before the election. The level of intensity is really rather high, and the individual Americans are focused on this campaign in a way that certainly in 2012 they were not. But the presidential candidates disagree on many, many things, including the proper way to conduct relations with China, certainly on all manner of issues related to the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you haven't heard Korea come up, or at least I have not heard Korea come up in the course of the presidential election. That is a good thing. It is a very good thing, because generally it's the problems that come up. And so the fact that Korea has not been an issue, and I don't think will be a big issue, or the relationship with Korea in the presidential campaign, I think is a reflection of a real consensus among the presidential candidates and among our politics more broadly about the fundamentals and the fundamental importance of America's relationship with Korea. So I think at the end of the day, it's a good news story. So let me close with that and invite my colleagues to speak, or questions, or long questions.
Let us think this way. Why don't we open to the floor?
Okay.
They can ask questions, whatever.
Sure.
And then whomever feels easy can answer.
Great.
Okay?
That sounds perfect.
Okay. Open to the floor. Yes, Professor Son.
Thank you. My name is Moon Song. I'm teaching lecturer Christian courses at Yonsei University. So this Monday, the U.S. National Security Advisor, Susan Rice, said the upcoming summit between the U.S. President Barack Obama and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping will be an opportunity to denuclearize the North Korea. However, as you know, the North Korea will not easily give up a nuclear weapon. Their argument as a nuclear power state in the global world. In the next U.S. president election, if the Republican Party will have the political power, so can you estimate some change and difference with Obama's administration in the U.S. foreign policy about North Korea's nuclear power? Thank you.
That's a good question, and in part it depends on who that Republican would be, because the Republicans themselves don't agree on foreign policy, and so you have candidates that take very different views on this. That said, I think whoever the next president is, and particularly if it's a change in party and as a Republican, I think they will make a reinvigorated effort at the at pressing North Korea to change its ways. What precisely that looks like, I don't know. I don't know if that's if it's a real re-embrace of the six-party talks, or one of the things, and we were discussing this earlier, that I think is an area that I hear some discussion about, and it could be a potential policy avenue for a new administration, is targeted financial measures on North Korean assets that are held outside the country, and using that as a source of leverage, sort of trying to bring back the Banco Delta Asia model that was used to some effect the last time around. So it's obviously a complex and a difficult set of challenges that North Korea is going to continue to pose, but I think I would expect a new administration to probably begin by reviewing North Korea policy and try to make a reinvigorated push. What precisely that looks like, I'm not sure.
Patrick, you want to add?
Certainly. One point to make is to simply say that the George W. Bush administration and the Barack Obama administration both looked to China to put more leverage on North Korea. And I don't think that changes in the next administration. I think there's now a bipartisan consensus, with the caveat, as Richard Fontaine just suggested, it does matter, of course, if you have a non-mainstream candidate come to power. But assuming that we're talking mainstream candidates being most likely, I think you continue to look to China. And that's why Susan Rice, Dr. Rice, emphasized as part of the cooperative agenda of China, not the competitive side where there's a big, heavy list of issues there. North Korea continues to be one of the cooperative areas that was talked about in Sunnylands. And while we haven't been able to get our Chinese friends to agree to real pressure, they certainly don't have any affection for Kim Jong-un. They certainly have a better relationship with our ally, South Korea. So there's more opportunity, especially if North Korea acts up in dangerous ways in the coming years, for even the next U.S. administration to try to figure out, as Richard Fontaine suggested, ways to triangulate and put both the carrots and sticks in a more convincing way to stop North Korea from effectively nuclearizing the peninsula and the region in a bigger way, and unsettling it in other ways. Anyway, that's an incomplete answer. But
Yes, Chairman Kim.
Your comment that the Korea is not coming up in political discussion is a good thing, because what comes up is a problem, which is very true in the reality of U.S. politics. But in a sense, that itself is a problem, because what it means is we are very reactive to the crisis, not looking at the long-term strategic sense. Let me just finish that and keep the back. I'm sorry. One of the problems, of course, is U.S. politics is four-year term. Now, the two-term is becoming more exception than real, and therefore, obviously, the ones in the administration as well as assistants, etc., have to think in terms of day politics today, etc. Let me push on to the further terms. The basic problems of China is agreeing to unification. Is their fear of sharing the border with the U.S. military. What is the U.S. view if, in the long term, we think in terms of, in the event China agrees to this unification, U.S. military would not go north, would stay only in the south. I mean, Chinese would want us to be out, but from our point of view, the security stay in. Is that kind of thought being thought out? Is one question. Another thing is, I think basically even China is becoming somewhat democratic in the sense that the people's communications, information, etc. is heading up. Their dislike of North Korea is becoming very, very prominent. And in the past they had it, but they had sort of suppressed it. But now it's openly in Guangzhou press, etc. is talking about very, I guess, antagonistic kind of comments coming up, and criticism is very loud. And I think the climate is getting ready for China to deal with South Korea more than North Korea. And of course, trade-wise, they have no question about it. But if they could overcome the fear of sharing the border with the U.S., would that be sufficient for them to get rid of that troubled some relationship with Kim Jong-un and become more peaceful regional arrangement? That's my question.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think at the Center for New American Security, we're doing some work specifically on unification scenarios and the implications for the United States. I think I don't believe the United States has a specific position on whether, if there was a unified Korea, would American troops stay in what would be southern Korea, and if that sort of got Chinese buy-in. I think the sort of starting point for this is to be able to sit down with the Chinese and discuss various unification scenarios so we can start to talk about that kind of thing. But my understanding is the Chinese have really shut down those conversations with the United States, at least at each point. They don't want to talk about unification scenarios because it suggests that the unification is not going to happen on the terms of Pyongyang. So it will be an important conceptual achievement, I think, if we can get the Chinese to the point where they are starting to think about a Korean peninsula that doesn't include the Kim regime in Pyongyang, but in fact is a unified Korean peninsula. And in that context, I think that a lot of things should be on the table for discussion. I mean, there are political elements to where American troops might or might not be stationed. They're also military and everything else. But I think that starting that conversation, if we could get the Chinese to that conversation, and I think that the combination of the disaffection that Kim Jong-un has produced in the Chinese, where the North Koreans have moved from kind of the embarrassing old uncle to the truly they see them as more kind of the dangerous sullen teenager kind of thing, to the combination of that and the closer ties between Seoul and Beijing may provide the opportunity to talk about the things that you're describing.
No, but there is a kind of widespread understanding in South Korea. If we have unification, whatever forms, in South Korean terms, or if we have unification mutual consensus, okay, then common threat and common enemy will disappear. And what is this raison d'etre for maintaining American alliance, US alliance in South Korea, and also sharing the burden, defense burden sharing with the United States? There are there kinds of wide national sentiments there. There is a kind of now when you talk about ROK's relations, or the conservative voices prevail. Therefore, in post-unification, there will be continuing American engagement here. Okay, there will be continuing alliance. But I would say that almost majority of South Koreans would not consider China as a potential threat. Some conservatives who emphasize in the so-called balancing strategy along with the United States against China would support it, but others would never consider China as a threat. And that being the case, after unification, it will be very difficult for us to justify continuing alliance. Maybe we can have some form of American forces here through the different kinds of arrangement, but how would you respond to that one? There's other voices too.
Yeah, I think that the question is less, would the presence of American troops be directed at one potential shared threat, and more are they a force for stability or instability in the region? And if they're a force for stability in the region, then there is a value to their continued emplacement in South Korea. We went through the same sort of debates in Europe after the demise of the Soviet Union, and Germans said, well, we don't need American troops stationed in Germany because the Soviet threat is gone. And in Japan, after the end of the Cold War, where they said, well, there's no communist menace to Japan. Do we really need, American troops stationed in Japan? The fundamental conclusion that those countries came to, as did the United States, is the troops stationed in those regions are fundamentally a source of stability, and you send that stability away at some potential cost. So I think there's a framing aspect to all of this, and I don't think that we will be successful if we say, there's a unified Korea, so the North Korean menace is gone, but China sort of stepped into the gap, so we have to square off against China. Are you with us? I don't think that's going to work.
I really want to hear your responses on that one. And according to Listen survey, and there was a question: if there is any kind of military conflict in South China Sea, okay, and suppose the United States and Japan supporting the Philippines and Vietnam, should South Korea join? 90% say no. How would you respond, to that kind of public perception in South Korea?
Let's avoid a conflict in the South China Sea.
That's the best way.
And the best way to do that is not to roll over and let China pave the South China Sea. It's rather for Korea to join a transparency regime, shared information, including with China, to start to help to make sure that everything in the South China Sea is transparent, so that we can put good negotiation and public pressure on a lot of these issues. But right now, there's no alternative to somebody has to mobilize a sort of the rule of law approach rather than the pursuit of might makes right. And that's what's happening right now with China and the South China Sea. We need South Korea to play a role. This goes back to what Richard Fontaine's talking about. The United States wants South Korea to play a bigger role in the region and in the world. And it can.
Let me just add to that. You raised the question that South Korea would be interested in the South Pacific dispute.
South China.
South China.
Yeah.
We should be, because we do have dispute with China. It's not really that spoken, but if we allow China to go their way in the South China areas, then we are also at the jeopardy, because what China is trying to do with South of
No, Chinese are saying, no, don't worry about freedom of navigation in South China Sea. South Korea will give a special guarantee that you will have a freedom of passage.
They can already say that. But
he belongs to the conservative party. He lived in America so long back.
It's very sensitive.
I'm the ultra conservative.
Let me invite the Professor Kim. Okay. He was the Secretary General of UNESCO National Commission in Korea.
Scientist and
Good for you.
He's a philosopher.
I wonder if you are willing to entertain a hypothetical question. Suppose that configuration of power and interest in this region, particularly surrounding Korea, remain the same, but suddenly North Korea begins to act like a normal country. It doesn't engage in
We know what normal country is.
kind of violence, and it conducts its business as any normal country would do, based on their national interests and so forth. Now, would the American interest in the region decrease in some way, or how would the American react to such a situation in which North Korea, you did say that Washington is beginning to think in terms of Korean Peninsula without North Korea, but with North Korea acting quite normally as a normal state, and South Koreans are willing to accept that situation. What changes would that bring any changes in the position of the United States?
With respect to Korea in particular, or Asia more broadly?
And the Asian pivot and
Yeah. I mean, I think in terms of the Asia pivot and all of that, I don't think it would change that much, because the concept behind the Rebalance to Asia and the reason why it has generated support from various quarters in Washington has to do with the economic dynamism of Asia as a region as a whole, with concerns about China and China's role in potentially rewriting or upending the existing rules-based order, with deepening security ties with countries like Japan and Australia and Vietnam and Singapore and Indonesia. And so, North Korea and what is happening on the peninsula is an important part of that, but I think all of that would continue in the absence of what you're describing. With respect to Korea in particular, I think we would end up going through one of the exercises, kind of what we were talking about before, in a way. I mean, what you're talking about is obviously not unification, but it's not an armed standoff between two countries, and so we'd have to go back to thinking about what is the rationale and the right configuration of the American presence in Korea and so forth. The only thing that I would add to all of that, though, is it sort of assumes that North Korea ratchets forward toward normal state and never goes backwards, and we'll see. So
Yes.
Reno teacher in Harlow School. I would love to know what is the importance of the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the rebalance dynamic of United States and in relation with South Korea, because South Korea is not part of it.
right. I took a bite right when you asked your question.
Don't rush on.
No. With the rebalance to Asia, the TPP is very, very important. It's so important that I believe Secretary Carter said something to the effect of he would trade an aircraft carrier strike group for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because for a couple of reasons. One, the economic benefits are important to the United States and to the countries that are going to be members. As a signaling measure, it demonstrates continued American engagement and presence in a region, again, that we think is of vital importance in the future. And in much of Asia, trade policy is foreign policy. It's not just economic policy that's sort of disaggregated from the broader geopolitical considerations. And then it's also a sign, I think, of shared American and partner leadership in a region that is not standing still in terms of its economic relations. If this was 10 years ago or 15 years ago and the TPP were to fail, there may not have been a lot of other things going on, but now trade agreements are breaking out everywhere. China is signing FTAs of its own sort all over the place, but so are other countries in the region. I think the next step after the TPP is to look at the countries that are not members of the TPP and see how they fit in. And one of the things that is going to be critical is to make sure that countries are not disadvantaged by not being a member of the TPP, but being a member of some other preferential trade agreement to which we are party. But it also leaves out India and other countries as well. So I think that's sort of the next stage after TPP is sort of examine, how do these things integrate? Because this proliferation of trade agreements across the region has led to this web or almost patchwork of preferences and sort of figuring out how we link these things together, if we do at all, I think is the next step, which could include Korea.
Professor Grove, are you about to talk something? Please.
Well, I actually wanted to say something about this idea of keeping the U.S. military in the South, and then your earlier comments about whether or not there was still a need for the U.S. in the region. I think China and the United States are going to square off in some sense, right? We have two massive heartland powers that have to project themselves through a navy. And so the question is, who, in some sense, do you want projecting power through you, right? So do you want China projecting power against Japan through South Korea, which I promise won't be a gentle process, or do you want the United States sort of playing Japan off, in a way through the alliance system and potentially projecting power, if not towards China, at least around China. And the historical example, I think, in geopolitics is Iran. Right? Iran, for a time, was basically divided between Russia and the British. And it was one of the worst periods of time in Iranian history in terms of political development. It had Russia and the British sabotaging politics on a regular basis in an effort to move that line between North and South just a little bit further in terms of political influence. And so if power projection is going to be an inevitability, I think this idea of a kind of shared peninsula after unification is not a good situation for South Korea. It is a great situation for South Korea that you've reached a stage of economic and political significance that you're being courted by the two biggest superpowers in the world. But I think they're qualitatively different, both in ambition and in terms of what it means for Korean political stability and political development. So I would be wary to say suddenly, well, you know, the war's over, so the war's over. I mean, geopolitics and geography still matter.
Specialist in debate.
Yeah.
Coaching Harvard debate team. And I think there's a sufficient room for debate, but okay.
There's a lot of debate to be had.
Dr. Tony, he's a retired full colonel. He used to teach at the National Defense University.
Okay, let me briefly last month's very incredible observation operation by South Korean Army regarding North Korean military provocation. As you may know, North Korea installed a mines inside the building, and then we resumed loudspeaker satellite operation against North Korea. Then North Korea also retaliated to conduct live fire, small arms, not heavy artillery. But the South Korean, one core commanders made a decision to retaliate promptly and massively by shelling of the 155 Harbinger. In terms of the ratio of the combat power between two forces, North Korea already won South Korea more than 100 times this case. This unusual exceptional retaliation by South Korea. We never observed that kind of brilliant campaign in South Korea. Unlike the sharing of the Yeonpyeong Islands, the United States did not allow South Korean forces to retaliate by airstrike against North Korea at the time. For this case, Army's rule of engagement did not apply proportionally normally. My point is, honestly speaking, South Korean forces is not in a position to manage the crisis on Korean Peninsula because of that Army's rule of engagement or some complicated complexity of command structures between ROK and US. And my point is, I think the United States needed to delegate whole authority to Korean armed forces to exercise operational control over our own forces. Even though the last year the SCM, the conditionally based traditional operating control over time, sooner or later, I think. What is your comment?
My comment is to ask Patrick if he has a view on this. Patrick has been deep into these kinds of issues for longer than I have.
It's hard. I mean, it's a very hard question to answer because, first of all, decision-making in an alliance is complex, and it's done in secret. And we don't really know. I wasn't at the table, so I can't really tell you that the Americans, for instance, restrained our South Korean ally. I think there was give and take on this issue. Were the Americans more cautious in terms of... Absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt we were the voice of caution on a disproportionate attack to poke, an eye for an eye and then break the glasses and nose of North Korea after YPO because of the potential for escalation. This actually goes back to why China really doesn't want to change unification. It's instability first. It's not the U.S. decision. So you can blame the United States, but we're also the reason why we're helping to deter real conflict, why North Korea ultimately backed down, because North Korea is not interested. This goes back to the irrationality, seeming irrationality. It's actually more rational, Kim Jong-un, right? He doesn't want a war. He had to back down. You forced him, we forced him to back down. So, I mean, this was a very successful sort of episode of deterrence. We can't rest on our laurels by any means, and we should always look for a diplomatic opening, but the reality is we also need to make sure that deterrence is there. And that wartime operational control issue, all of these are very, very complex parts of alliance management. And the most important thing is that we make the decisions together, and that we build goodwill and understanding on both sides about that. Because the stakes are high. We've died for each other on the battlefield. I mean, this is a true alliance, and I think there's so much goodwill in the ROK-U.S. alliance.
Dr. Zhang, you got to blame the South Korean government, not the U.S. government.
Well, I'm not blaming the South Korean government. I'm not blaming governments. I think that but these are decisions that are made around the table. I know South Korean generals and American generals, and I know politicians on both sides. Yeah, there's a lot of blame to go around on any one decision. We know that. But South Korea and the United States are ultimately more cautious. We're more responsible states. Because we've helped create the success in the international system, right? So North Korea, they're the outlier. They are a pariah state. They've got very little to lose. That's one reason why they are so dangerous. There's potential for miscalculation, and there's also a potential for sudden change, frankly, from an assassination inside North Korea. Who knows? I mean, we don't know whether that's likely, but it's more likely than other types of sort of regime change. So we have to err on the side of caution. And the fact that North Korea backed down meant they didn't want to test the counter-provocation plan, in my mind.
But I think the American forces in South Korea have played very important stabilizing role. For example, in the case of Wooden Box, mine case,
Yes.
United Nations Command instantly intervened.
That's right.
Okay, and control the situation. Because by knowing that South Korea could react disproportionately. Therefore, in this sense, but in the case of Cheonan or Yeonpyeong case, U.S. did not intervene. Okay, but we can clearly see that the kinds of American role in stabilizing the situation.
I think one of the things we should note is that we U.S. reacted to those provocation twice. Once at the Panmunjom when the major was axed to death. It was quite surprising how restrained the U.S. response was. They acted very decisively, let them know, but they didn't overreact to make it any bigger. And second time, of course, a Pueblo situation, which of course U.S. was at fault because it was inside the border, but nevertheless, they did not go over it. Another thing interesting is also a Chinese gentleman, I think if I know, everybody knows, indicated something very interesting. It says, this is almost 7-8 years ago, he said, I was having a conversation with him, said that he made it very definitively China would never allow North Korea to have nuclear arm. So I said, well, if you are so forcefully, why aren't you stopping them commercially?
Yeah.
You give them, half the petrol and 1/3 of the food, you can just shut it off. And just, no, we cannot do that. He said, why? Well, we know that it can make their life more difficult, but it will not stop. And he says, remember, when we did in the 60s, we were poorer than them, and we made nuclear arms. So if they want to make it, we can make it harder, but we cannot stop. So they are not going to do this very so. Then you are saying that you stop the military? No, of course not. So I said, that makes sense. You said definitely we will not allow, but you are not doing it economically, and you are not going to do it politically. Then how are we going to do it? And his answer was really cute. That's why we wouldn't mind if the U.S. bomb it out.
You wanted to raise a question?
Yeah, sure
Would
thing.
you identify yourself?
Sure, my name is Jason Strelzer. I'm a freelance journalist. I'm based here in Seoul for about 9 years. North Korea's drone program is open to anyone who wants to take it. What kind of countermeasures should the U.S. get involved with countermeasures about North Korea's drones? I mean, so far I think the Ministry of Defense says they found 4 crashed surveillance drones, but I was speaking with an analyst recently who believes North Korea has a fleet of around 320 drones, 20 of which being, militarized UAVs. What can or should the U.S. do in this situation?
Well, I would invite others to speak on this one, but I guess what I would say is I think, I would tend toward protecting South Korean airspace from any sort of intrusions, and drones are unmanned, but they have the potential to carry out the same kinds of activities that manned aircraft do in terms of both surveillance and armed drones. And so there is we're in a different world with drones than than we have been with fighter aircraft, for example, or surveillance aircraft, in the sense that you can't go through the same protocols if someone enters your airspace as you can with manned aircraft. You know, the sort of standard protocol of, you know, radio tell him he's in the wrong place. If he doesn't respond, you scramble jets, you send the jets up, they signal to him, tell him he's, you know, needs to go away. You can sort of force him out or try to force him down. Well, if a drone comes in, what do? Pick up the phone and call, you know, the guy you think is controlling it? Well, that's hard to do. But I would think, as a general rule, you would extend the same protection from drones to airspace over South Korea as you would for any other sort of military aircraft coming in from the north.
Okay. That's all from Dong AD, and after, your name was not? Okay, after, my
name is Paul, and I'm working for one of this company, and right now around Denmark, the Deputy Vice Secretary of Defense Ministry is here in Korea negotiating something with Koreans, and he was looking for the CNAS, and so maybe you have some kind of how can I say, advice for Korean negotiators or cabinet and answer for Koreans to negotiating with him.
When I started at CNAS, there was a small little office, and there were two people that were sharing that office, and one was Abe Denmark, and the other was Andrew Exum, and now Abe Denmark is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia, and Andrew Exum is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Middle East. So I didn't realize, you know, all of the power that resided in this one, I think maybe windowless office. But Abe was the engine room of the think tank. But Abe
when was it?
That was in 2009, 2010. Yeah. But Abe was Patrick's deputy, so I don't know, do you have insights into the workings of the Denmark mine?
Certainly, I briefed Abe before he came over. I mean, Abe is a very, very strong supporter of the alliance. Very able China analyst as well, and understands the issues of Northeast Asia. So he has a great track record. He had worked in the Office of the Secretary of Defense before, and is obviously working within the guidance that he's being given as well. So Assistant Secretary David Shear, and all the way up through to Secretary Carter, and then to the White House and the interagency. I mean, there are a lot of people who make decisions in a democracy. So I think his task is to make sure, especially with the summit coming up, that we're prepared for surprises on the part of North Korea, and that we are strengthening the alliance, and we have a list of ways to further strengthen the alliance, regardless of the eventuality of what happens. So it's complex what we might do. For instance, if there's a 3-stage rocket launch or a 4th nuclear test, and maybe it doesn't happen October 10th, maybe it happens in the middle of the summit, or maybe it happens next year. But there will be other provocations, and we need to be constantly working hard, and I think that's exactly what Abe is doing with his counterparts here. So he's the right person for the job. I mean, he's a good member of the team. My other deputy, by the way, just most recently became the Deputy National Security Advisor to Vice President Joe Biden, who many people think may be, you know, a presidential candidate very soon.
So the lesson is become Patrick's deputy, and then you go on to these, you know, big jobs.
I don't go anywhere, but they all do very well.
Okay, your name was Sam?
I'm Koichi Onemura. I'm a Seoul Bureau Chief since this April. And it's not a big question. It is said that, or at least Korean newspapers said that Japanese diplomats in Washington, D.C. are heavily lobbying against South Korea, telling,
Heavily
lobbying against
lobbying, telling that, you know, South Korea and China relationship is getting closer and closer, and South Korea is going to China. Is it true?
I have not. We talk to Japanese diplomats all the time, visiting from Tokyo in the embassy, and I haven't seen that. I have not seen them coming in and lobbying against Korea. So I have not seen
But they have such perception. But they do not
I mean, really, the thing that we end up discussing with the Japanese, as with so many other officials from Asian countries, is China. And so, it's almost a contest of how many seconds will elapse between the time the conversation starts, between the first person will say China. And so really the issue tends to revolve around China. I have not heard much from them about the Korean angle to this. I don't know if you have a different view at all.
Can I just say one very briefly to say the alarming thing is that the Japanese are not talking about Korea very much. We're concerned about that.
No, Patrick, I was in Tokyo.
Yes.
I was in Washington last week.
You're always
and after Washington, I dropped in Tokyo, and we are talking about this issue. But let me ask this blunt question: is it conceivable for Washington to have just Tokyo alone, let Seoul go to Beijing? Okay.
Conceivable for whom?
For the U.S. to give up South Korea in favor of Japan by solidifying just bilateral alliance between Tokyo and Washington.
No.
Are you abandoning this?
Some people that
The corner.
South Korea will, whether unified Korea or South Korea, will eventually betray the United States. They will bandwagon with China. Therefore, it is better to solidify Washington-Tokyo ties.
No.
I heard that kind of argument, right?
Well, I would just say a couple of things. One, good U.S.-Korea ties is not a restraint on good U.S.-Japan ties. So it doesn't follow that if we gave up Korea, we would have stronger U.S.-Japan ties. Second, the sort of cornerstones of American strategy in Northeast Asia are built around our alliances with Japan and South Korea. And that is extraordinarily important, both for reasons of geography and history and shared values and everything else that is very important to the American people. And it has been an extraordinarily successful and productive alliance. And so why we would be content, happy, positive, or in any other way with the notion that alliance would go away, that doesn't strike me as something that people would welcome.
No, I mean, you'll hear lots of crazy things, unfortunately, on the United States, especially during this campaign season. But there is an isolationist strain. There are resource constraints, and there is a fractionated debate. There's no consensus on what the core issues are. But the mainstream, despite that, in contradiction to that, still there's a hard mainstream Democratic-Republican consensus that we need to be more anchored in this region. We're a great trading nation. We want to do more trading. That's why we got the bilateral, of course, trade agreement, because that was the easier one, as hard as that was. Multilateral was really tough, but we're going to get that done. We're going to go on to phase 2 of TPP. We're going to join it up with RCEP eventually and help shape the rules of this road. We need Korea to do that. We can't do it on our own. Korea is a major player. We want to work with Korea on these issues. Japan has real demographic decline, and we want to preserve Japan as a major player too. So we have a common interest in that. And believe me, the Korean Peninsula, if something really bad happens here, we're going to need Japan.
Fantastic. Sorry, I'm talking too much. Being the moderator, but we had a conference with the Wilson Center, and Jim Shop and Michael Green,
who said
there, and I was moderating there too.
Neither one of them said that.
I asked but I asked them question. We Koreans argue that we are linchpin of American alliance.
Yes.
Japanese say we are cornerstone of American alliance.
Right.
How can you make a distinction between linchpin and cornerstone, and which is more important for the United States? They couldn't answer. Neither Jim Sharp nor Michael Green could not answer. No, could answer. Those.
Right.
Since you are very good at that, I hope that we can hear some definitive answer from you.
Yes, the definitive answer is that we love to be loved. We're Americans. And if you're telling me the Koreans and Japanese are vying for our love...
What is since you're a native speaker, okay?
Yes, okay.
What is the distinction between linchpin and cornerstone?
Different. Cornerstone has to do with building a building.
Yes.
Right?
Linchpin is linking, right?
Yeah, exactly. So you're different degrees of mechanical engineering.
No, but cornerstone is more important than linchpin. Japan is more important than South Korea.
The problem when if you if you ever read things that you know Americans officials say linchpin or cornerstone, and you try to read meaning into it, it's not always appropriate.
Thesaurus, right?
Yeah, you know, it's not always true that these are the products of considered thought and, you know, a weighing of this and that and, you know, messaging and everything. Sometimes it's the guy at 12.
Telling me that those terms came from the DOD, Pentagon, not from State Department.
I don't know. My point is, I don't know that it means
If
any.
you pull the cornerstone out of the building, what happens? If you pull the linchpin out of the chain, what happens?
Same.
Right?
Same thing. We
There's
can't
three
do
other
without
corners.
either one.
Yeah.
That's the point.
That's the point.
No, cornerstone is important.
You want to be cornerstone.
You have only 4 cornerstones,
You wanna flip
but
them?
linchpins you have in a cornerstone and column in a link, okay, and each column has at least 2 or 4 linchpins. Therefore,
Don't dictionary.
well, okay. Mark, do you have any questions? Mark, so from Berlin.
Sorry. I enjoyed listening from the US perspective. I live in Berlin, Germany, so I look at completely different point of view. And then I just...
By the way, he has been working with German government in helping North Korea. He has been instrumental in bringing a lot of young scientists from DPRK to Germany.
I spent a week last week in Pyongyang. And I traveled to Hamhung and Wonsan and Hungnam. And three things. I was shocked. The things were changing very rapidly. I was there last year, and then for the first time I could watch smiling North Koreans. One fed, and then young people. So it's changing. And then this year I saw rapid changes. I saw many taxis in Pyongyang and also countryside. And they said taxes are run by government agencies in order to get our currency from the people, because people have to pay US dollars. 1 kilometer, $4. In countryside, a little cheaper. But this, because people are amassing foreign currencies at their home. They don't save in the bank because they will lose. So they keep it for foreign currencies. US dollar, very most loved, and euro, and Japanese yen, and Chinese yuan. So it's a strange country. Your own currency has no value. So the foreign currency is widespread and they could control. They gave up. So I have to take US dollars or euro and then I have to pay. But for me, because they consider me as a foreigner, the exchange rate is 1 US dollars, 100 North Korean won. According to they said black market, 8,200. So it's, they try to
Extortion.
in every way try to get money. So rapid changes, things are changing. People are not because the top to bottom, not the government is doing anything or opening up or reforming, but the people are already adapting the market economy and they are living on markets. And the money is doing businesses, and I could see every corner.
So take that forward 5 years. What happens with the growth of that market economy? I mean, what?
Okay, it depends on South Korea and the US, basically. But I will mention one point after you mentioned about the Chinese influence in North Korea. It's gone. The economic cooperation is there. Nothing changed. And China still supplies oil and foodstuffs. But the political influence is almost very, very insignificant. Just for example, China appointed a new ambassador to Pyongyang, and he has been begging for audience in Germany. So it's a very, very different compared to his grandfather and father, because they used to go to Chinese embassy and visit them and entertain them. But Kim Jong-un is ignoring China. So it's a new change. I mean, when I returned to China Saturday, and I briefed with Chinese colleagues, and they admitted, they said it's very, very difficult. And then North Korea is at the moment doing everything. The whole country is on the move for the celebration of October 10th. That's the 70th anniversary of the founding of the Workers' Party. So the whole country is, I went to countryside to see it, but everybody is preparing. From September 9th, that's also an important holiday. From then on, whole month, they are preparing military parade. They said it will be bigger than China. And then the torch parade, I saw it twice, but it's just really fearsome. These young kids with a torch, they just march through, and with it's a unification or self-reliance, whatever. This is very fearsome. But they will also organize almost mass demonstrations against Japan and China. And the important thing is
against China, not against the United States.
U.S. and then Japan. Maybe China too. And then Japan will be more like it's for the domestic consumption. They are doing everything to keep the people in line, to put it together, because people don't like Kim Jong-un. He's young, and then they think he's worse than his father. So they are just using the pressure from our side and the international sanctions in order to keep the country in control.
I can just confirm I was also in Pyongyang last week.
You all pronounce Korean.
And we were made to visit the Victory Museum, and the Chinese intervention in the Korean War is hardly mentioned in that museum, so it's quite a significant aspect. But we also had discussions on peninsular affairs and on foreign policy matters. And it is clear that North Korea leadership believes in the deterrence value of the weapon. And I think we can assume that they will have it sometime down the line. And the rational attitude would be to start to think, what do we do then? How do we act with North Korea then? Rather than to make scenarios where North Korea all of a sudden disappears as North Korea. I think their pursuit is to say Iran is not an example for us, Cuba is not an example for us, we are a special case, and we don't give up our pursuit of the weapon, and we will have the weapon, and then we can talk on an even level with the world. That's the clear attitude, and I think compared to when I was last there in May, this has become even more clear, more stronger commitment, even by people who are more inclined to dialogue, or who were more inclined to dialogue. They now pursue exclusively this line of argument. And I think that the August incident has had impact in this respect, that the willingness for more constructive outside engagement has declined amongst the international department of the party whom we are interacting with, and they have now this very straight single line: we are going to have the weapon, and then we can talk. I think. And from there, I'm asking myself, what do we do for that time? How are we going? Right now, all our policies are geared towards preventing North Korea from developing the weapon. What do we do once they have the weapon? How is that going to change the regional gameplay? How is that going to change the global setting?
Why don't you answer? After that, I think we should, finish, because you have another appointment in South Han River, Gangnam. It takes some time, traffic jams.
Yes.
Please.
Well,
maybe both of you, maybe including Professor Grohl, can answer.
Well, I mean, we don't need to evaluate the scenario if they get nuclear weapons on the line, because they've had nuclear weapons already. So, I mean, they're a nuclear weapons possessing state. So, I don't think that, for me, that it's not a question of what do we do if they get a nuclear weapon. It's what do we do now? They have nuclear weapons. So it's not a question of scenario. I agree with you that I think they're extraordinarily unlikely to get them up. president is pretty clear that if you are okay with pariah status in the international community, which North Korea seems to be, then possessing nuclear weapons gives you international relevance and a measure of protection that giving them up will not. And I think that's going to be hard to overcome.
Patrick?
History is littered with examples of missed opportunities. One of the missed opportunities was Kim Jong-un when he first came to power. And he took on essentially the deal that we brokered, the United States helped to broker, for a moratorium, which is not denuclearization, as you know. It's just freezing things where they are. That lasted for less than 2 weeks, unfortunately. That was a missed opportunity. You don't get many chances to build trust or break trust. So North Korea is exactly where they deserve to be right now. There's a reason why they haven't been, Kim Jong-un has not been invited to China. And the reason he's not going to be invited to the United States.
So he has been invited to China, but he didn't accept the invitation.
Well, that's debatable.
Today my interview with the Yonhap News showed up.
You mean to the parade, maybe?
I got a phone call from the foreign ministry saying that because I said that Foreign Minister Wang Yi wanted to visit Pyongyang. Pyongyang said no. And then party decided to send Wang Zerui, the head of external liaison office in Pyongyang, who has very good tie with Pyongyang. He was rejected. And then the foreign minister folks, made a phone call to me that it's very different from what we heard from official lines. But I heard from the unofficial lines. But that is, we have a different interpretation of what's going on. But what I heard, the information which I got from the very, very reliable sources who have been dealing with North Korea. Therefore, we got a very, very, objective in, analyzing, Chinese, relationship with North Korea, with sometimes tend to have a self-serving interpretation or wishful thinking interpretation of Beijing-Pyongyang relations. Professor Grove?
I'll say two quick things. The first is that we shouldn't get too excited that there's a U.S. dollar economy in North Korea, because Cuba had a U.S. dollar economy for 3 decades, and it actually strengthened the regime because it meant that their economy could function at 2 different levels. The second, though, is a question back, which is, in a long-term scenario of reunification, South Korea is a sovereign state. It reunifies with a maybe fairly capable nuclear power. Does South Korea keep the nuclear weapons so that it can now, if not, probably not be a pariah state and keep the U.S. and China at bay? And I wonder if South Koreans are already starting to think about the eventuality that they might have to face not developing nuclear weapons but inheriting them. And I would think
some nationalists.
I'm sure, and I think it's probably a terrible idea, but it's probably worth having that conversation now.
There are some lunatics who argue why not. But those guys who rise with the nuclear weapons, fall with the nuclear weapons, they learn a very simple historical lesson.
Can I ask one quick question?
No. They should rush.
Huh?
You can talk afterwards.
Okay, all right.
Okay. And then let us give a big applause.
Thank you very much.